Hi, this is Carl Rust, and I've worked in schools for over 30 years. I've learned a lot about how people learn, and I wrote a book called Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn: How We Can Transform Schools and Reintroduce Natural Learning. Hey, everybody, welcome to Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn podcast. Got a special guest today, Irene Daria, who is an author, a cognitive psychologist, and she's worn lots of different hats in her life. And I'm just going to let her tell you a little bit about herself. And we're going to talk about her new book that's coming out in about a week, isn't it,
By the
Irene?
time this airs, it will be out. It's coming out August 20th. So I think
Okay.
by the time this airs, it will be available
Okay.
on Amazon and ready to go.
So she's got a really fascinating story and some things that I think will really resonate with people. So welcome, Irene, and maybe you could talk a little bit about yourself and your background.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Carl. Very happy to be here. So my name is Irene Daria. I'm the author of I Didn't Believe Him, which is a book that tells the story of, it uses my son's story as a window to show exactly how schools have turned millions of kids into struggling readers. There's a sort of a three-prong, the book has three parts or prongs. It takes you behind the scenes of a well-regarded school so you can see exactly what went wrong in his classroom. It takes you behind the scenes of my family's life. It shows you how the ineffective teaching of reading, the pain that it caused my younger son, the worry, work, and exhaustion that it caused me. At the time of our story, I was not yet, I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist, Carl, as you mentioned. At the time of the story, I was not. I had just begun my graduate studies. I used to be a journalist before I went back to school for my PhD. So I was, quote unquote, just a mom and who knew nothing at all, literally zip, about how children learn to read. And I needed to figure out how to teach them to do so myself, because at the time we could not afford to hire a tutor. So it tells the story of what that was like for me. It tells the story of the impact that had on my marriage, the stress that it caused. And it tells the story of how my older son was impacted by having a child who was not being taught to read in school and a mom who was obsessed with figuring out how to teach him to do so. And it also tells the history of reading instruction in our country. So that's maybe a little bit more about my book than about me, but basically I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist. I own a K-12 tutoring company in New York City. And we specialize basically in plugging in the holes in the education of, sort of what kids, what the parents feel their children are not getting in school. We offer enrichment and we offer support also to kids who are, just need basic support. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay. So one of the things I like to ask people is about your own experience in school and maybe some of your early memories of what it was like to be in school. What do you remember about your early school years?
I loved school from beginning to end, from kindergarten to PhD. I loved learning. I loved going to school. I loved having friends in school. And this is before it was sort of the thing to do. I joined every activity you could join after school. Had a very, very, very positive experience of school. I don't remember how I learned to read. I know I learned early. I know my older brother read with me at home, but I have no idea how I learned to read myself. Can't tell you.
That's interesting because one of the things about your book that I found, and I haven't finished it yet, to be honest, but one thing I found about reading the early part is I started thinking about myself and my own children. And I've always been a reader. My kids have always been readers. And I couldn't think about how in the heck did I learn to read. So I started going to school in the 60s. So and I remember Dick and Jane and, Spot and all that kind of stuff. But I also kind of remember that we read at home all the time. My parents were readers and they read to me and we had books all over, kind of like what you described your family.
My family, not my
Yeah,
family of birth. I'm the child
right.
of immigrants, so
Okay.
like my brother read to me, and
Hmm.
my parents made sure my brother read to me. My parents never read to me. Like they were sort of yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
That's okay. I mean, but I was just, to me, it was almost two separate worlds. The world of reading at school, I wasn't very fond of because I felt self-conscious and I felt, we did a lot of round robin reading. We did a lot of where I felt a lot of pressure and a lot of anxiety about reading. But outside of school, I read a lot. So anyway, that was one thing that started me thinking, and I started asking people then because I saw my two sons over the weekend, and I said, "What do you guys remember about learning to read?" And so it's kind of interesting to me even think about that part of it.
Mhm.
So you sound like one of the kids that teachers love to have that want to do it. They're enthusiastic and want to do everything. Um, did you have any negative experiences in school, or was it mostly just positive?
I remember I transferred from public school to Catholic school in fourth grade. There was a teacher strike that went on and on and on and on. And my parents moved me to a Catholic school. And I remember for the first time I was taught grammar, and that was so difficult for me. I just could not understand what a verb was. I just couldn't get it. I could not understand. And I remember raising my hand. This is probably, oh, I sound like such a little brown noser, but um, it's the first time I remember making a mistake in school. The teacher wrote the word island on the board and said, "Can anyone read this?" And this makes me think I learned, obviously, with phonics. I raised my hand and read it as island.
Uh-huh.
And she said no. And I was like, oh no. um, Negative. In high school, there was the usual sometimes like social stuff would happen, but nothing. Honestly, no. I mean, it's 99% positive. Although, well, no, this is off topic. It's maybe it isn't off topic. In grad school, where I went to grad school, there were researchers who were really big on attachment theory, that
Mhm.
babies need to get attached to their mothers or they're in trouble. And everyone in the class had to do a presentation on a paper, and I read a paper, and there was just something wrong with this paper. It just wasn't complete. So I went and got the book and read the whole book and realized that this paper on purpose had left out research that said that, yes, babies need to get attached, but they can get attached to their uncles, or they can get attached to their older siblings, or they can get attached to a next door neighbor. Otherwise, our species would be in a lot of trouble, right? Imagine.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
and I said this in my presentation, and the professor looked at me as if I was like manure, because it went against her research belief and and it was the only, I got mostly A's in my courses. It was the only B plus I got was in that course. And I thought, that's interesting. It's because she didn't like what I brought to the table. And I thought, man, a researcher should really want to hear other aspects and other angles and think, how can this, it's not that her research is wrong. I mean, her research would be all the more valuable if it was shown that you can get attached to anyone and thrive. So that was my biggest, I think, negative experience in school.
Well, the next thing I usually ask people is about their experiences with their children, which leads right into what you wrote about in your book. So how have your children experienced school?
So I feel like I'm maybe going to be telling you too many long stories, and we're
Okay.
not really going, like, we can go towards whatever point you're going towards,
Hmm.
but because it's such a long story. I mean, we live in New York City where children test into the better schools, and where, schools can be very competitive. And my older son had that experience, but that's a little off topic.
Hmm.
So one son, they both ended up in very rigorous academic schools.
Hmm.
A lot of pressure, a lot of testing. They both say they will never raise their children in New York City for that reason.
It's
But
interesting.
that's a whole, I think, other maybe podcast.
Yeah, I noticed that in your book, you talk about that a little bit. It's different than I'm in the Midwest. I'm in Indiana right now, and I grew up in Ohio. So you pretty much went to your school, your neighborhood school for the most part. It's changed a little bit now, because in Indiana we have open enrollment. So where I physically live, well, I live in a school district, but there's like three really close. So if I'm willing to transport my child, I could go to any school system.
That's great. Very
So
lucky.
if I wanted to go across the highway, there's Bago schools and then there's Elkhart Community Schools, and I live in Concord. Um, but very few people do that, and maybe more now. But when I was growing up, though, it wasn't a thing at all. And when my kids were growing up, you just went to your school. That was the school you went to. So that's a little different. Um, so with your so tell a little bit about your book. I don't want to cut it out totally, but I uh, tell a little bit about your son Eric and his experiences in kindergarten, and or maybe a little before that, because I think it's interesting to look at what he was like before he entered kindergarten and how that
Mhm,
maybe changed.
mhm. So Eric, by nature, his personality, he was a very extroverted, chatty little boy. And his preschool teachers called him the cheerleader of the school because I guess he was like me, like, rah, rah, this is fun,
Yeah.
let's do it all. And he would be sitting in the front of the room and sort of participating in everything. And kindergarten came along, and this is something that I think is the crux of the story and the crux of why I wrote the book, because writing a book, as you may or may not know, I don't know if you've written any books,
Hmm.
writing a book is a big endeavor. It takes a
Hmm.
lot of time and effort, and a lot of time and effort went into this book and into researching exactly what happened and what went wrong and what's going wrong. But I was driven to write it. I had to write it because I blamed myself for not listening to my son and for what his kindergarten year was like for him. So his kindergarten year was a nightmare for him. He he came home. Now he was 5 years old, Carl. 5 years old. That's
Hmm.
really young.
Hmm.
He came home from school and he said to me, Mommy, my school isn't teaching me how to read. They tell us to look at the pictures and guess what words are. And that's not reading, Mommy. How do you read? And I was so impressed with his school, this being New York City. He had applied to it was a public school, but it was a school that you had to apply to. Very few kids got in. And he got in on his own steam. Again, this is before I owned a tutoring company, before I knew anything about tutoring. We didn't prepare him for the, admissions test, nothing. We brought the kid to school, he tested, he got in, and I was overjoyed because our local public school taught constructivist math where they didn't teach the algorithm. There were X million ways of solving a problem. The kids were completely confused. I had to teach my older son, the addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division algorithm. And constructivist math, I think, is wonderful for older kids. I would flip the way it's taught. I would teach traditional math first, and then I would, once you have those skills under your belt, then, oh, look how interesting this is, what you can
Hmm.
do and how you can take numbers apart. But there was such confusion in the kids, and everybody was tutoring their kids in math. And I tutored my son in math, and I didn't want to do that for Eric. And that's actually how he ended up at this other school. Which taught math in the same way, by the way.
Yeah.
So much you don't know as a parent.
Yeah.
But I was so impressed with his school that I said, you're going to a great school, Eric, trust them. They will teach you how to read. And they didn't. And I told him to trust his school, even though I had gone to a presentation where they explained a little bit about how they taught reading, and I had no idea what they were talking about. But that's the level of trust I had in the school. They must know they have this great reputation. I'm going to trust them. Well, and I don't know, just to explain a little bit for your listeners who may not know, so there are basically reading wars have been going on in our country for over, almost 100 years now. So this isn't anything new, what happened to him. In fact, sadly, it's very, 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 it's happened to so many kids. But you can either teach kids how to sound out words, so that they'll be able to sound out words that they come across that they haven't, memorized or seen before, or this method called balanced literacy is based on an earlier method called whole language, which believed that learning to read is as natural as learning to speak. And if you surround children with books and read to them, they will pick up reading the way we picked up spoken language. And learning to read is not natural. It can't be natural because reading is a man-made invention. And we have an alphabetic language, but the way this method, balanced literacy, teaches kids to read is it uses a method called 3 cueing, which has kids either guess the words from the picture, use context, or use the first letter of a word to try to figure out the word. And the way this came to be was a man named Kenneth Goodman, who was one of the founders of whole language, did a quote unquote study. It really isn't a study, but he like observed, I shouldn't say study, he observed readers reading. And what he failed to think, just like, interesting, we go back to my PhD course, just like the professor who failed to think of something that might have helped her research or helped her understand what she was observing, he failed to think that he was watching struggling readers read. He thought he was watching kids read, that what he observed could translate to all children. And what he observed, these struggling readers who had been taught with an earlier method of whole language, which was Dick and Jane, which had kids just memorize whole words. It also did not teach phonics. So these kids did not know how to sound out words. He observed that these struggling children who were drowning, right, who were struggling and doing the doggy paddle, trying to read what was given to them, they guessed from the picture, they used the context, and they used the first letter of the word only. And he observed that when they used the first letter of the word only, they made the most mistakes. So he concluded phonics was the worst approach that you could take to teaching reading. Never stopping to think these kids had no idea how to sound out words. So yeah, of course they were, quote, sounding them out incorrectly, and maybe the picture helped them more than their incorrect sounding out. But sort of unbelievably, this one paper, which she wrote about it, then the entire educational establishment took on this method of teaching reading. And that's how my son Eric was taught, and that's why he did not learn how to read in kindergarten. He began having nightmares. He was dreaming that he was drowning. He was dreaming that he was lost forever. Imagine what it feels like. A year in a 5-year-old child's life is a really long time. He started saying he hated school. He moved to the back of the classroom and sat there silently with his head bowed in shame. It still brings tears to my eyes 17 years later to remember how he suffered because of this. And I think I wrote this book to help prevent this from happening. One of the reasons I wrote the book was because I had to. I mean, I used to be a writer, and this was a story that I had to tell, like it or not. I woke up thinking about it all the time. My life would not go on until I wrote it. But a more conscious reason of why I wrote it is I wanted to help prevent this from happening in other people's lives, because he had memorized every story that he brought home, so he appeared to be reading. He brought home great grades in reading. So there was no way that I could have known he was not learning how to read. And he, at the age of 6, finally got through to me. And if he had not done this one thing, I shudder to think what would have happened to his academic life, because I would have continued to have trusted his school. He came home and he took a book, he held it behind his back. It was, I don't remember the name of it, but it was a little pattern book that had repeated sentences on each page, so it was very easy to memorize. He held it behind his back, and turning the pages at exactly the right time, he quote unquote read the book. A house is a home, turn the page. A teepee is a home, turn the page. So you see how you can use the picture.
So this is like still in kindergarten that he was
first grade.
First grade,
the beginning of first grade. An apartment building is a home. And I realized he'd memorized all his books, and that's when I stepped up to the plate and began teaching him to read.
So when he was 5 years old, he realized that there was an issue.
5 years old.
And he could probably see other kids around him that were doing things. And I think you kind of said in your book that some of the kids were kind of going with the program. So they were, memorizing, like you're saying, and they were just kind of cheerfully participating in this, but he didn't like it. He felt something was wrong, that he wasn't learning what he needed to learn. So he was coming home to you and saying, they're not.
Well, what I hadn't realized was how many parents had taught their kids how to read at home. How many parents had taught their kids to read before they started kindergarten. This is, again, it's a matter of, where you live, it's a very big country that we live in. And this is New York City, and his school was on the Upper East Side, which is the wealthiest neighborhood in New York. That was not where we lived. We lived in Greenwich Village, which is more about let your kids play in preschool, which is how I was, and I had not worked with him on reading, but on the Upper East Side, these are very driven and successful people, for the most part. And I would say 70% of his class started kindergarten knowing how to read, 65 to 70% of his class. The other kids, the one that you say that I mentioned in my book, they were going with the program. It was pretending to read. Lucy Calkins in her book, The Art of Teaching Reading, says, yes, they can't read in kindergarten, but they should pretend to read. And so the teacher would have this big book at the front of the room, and she would be pointing to the words, and she read the same story every day, and the kids would be reciting the words. And
was she pointing at the words while they said the word?
Okay. Yes, she was pointing.
A little bit about me. So I was a classroom teacher for 17 years, but mostly older grades. I mostly taught 6th grade. I did 4th twice and 5th once, and then I did 6th grade with 14 times. Then I was assistant principal. And so I was responsible for evaluating teachers and observing them. And what I've said for a long time is we should be trying to meet the needs of the kids. So too many times school tends to turn things upside down, I think, and serve the needs of the adults. So that if you're fortunate enough to get into a classroom with a teacher that understands kind of the things that you're talking about, and they can give kids what they need. If you're not fortunate, you may be in a classroom and the teacher either doesn't know or doesn't want to somewhat fight the system. And so they go with whatever the program is that's the school is presenting. It that changes over time, as you know. But I trying to remember too in the classrooms, and I think the teachers, most of the teachers at my school that were effective teachers were still teaching kids how to sound out words. And I must have learned it when I was in school, and I think my children did too, because I still do it. So, and whenever being a sixth grade teacher, I mean, I had kids come to me that weren't good readers. And I had some that were already very proficient readers. And I had some that were not good. And I think the strategy that I used, not that I was saying that I was a great reading teacher, but because I went to Ohio State, I got my degree, my bachelor's degree in 1988, and that was a whole language school. That's what we
Yeah, that's
learned.
the, mhm.
That's what we learned. But personally, and maybe it's me personally, I've never been a person to just be given a program and say, okay, I'm just going to faithfully adhere to this program no matter what.
Good for you.
I always said, what do they need? And so if I was working with a kid, I would employ strategies that I had learned, to help them understand, sound out the word, and context clues and all that was well and good. And one thing I want to ask you about at some point is about pictures, because that was kind of a big deal in the balanced literacy program that your son experienced. Was the picture was like the almighty clue, right? You look at don't know the word, look at the picture. So I guess what I'm trying to get to is the thing that really struck me about your story is, here's a little boy that realizes something's wrong. And at 5 years old, they're going to have a hard time expressing that to the teacher, but they can come home to you and say, Mom, something's wrong. And what I've tried to encourage parents, and I did write a book, by the way. One of the chapters in my book is about how schools should listen more to families and kids. And so I'm a firm believer in, if something's going wrong at your school, you need to find out what's going on and you need to advocate for your child. And that's what you did. And that was really impressive to me. And you didn't give up either, because, you talked to one teacher, you talked to another teacher, you talked to the principal. And being a person that was on the other side of some of those conversations, I can relate to how sometimes parents are treated. Because I don't know if you're familiar with Ivan Illich in his book, Deschooling Society, but I think it was 1970, he wrote about how we've created this professional class of educators, and now we just think that these guys know everything, and that people that have not been trained in schools of education don't know anything. And so we should always listen to the school. We should always listen to the teacher. And somebody that's been on the inside of that, I can say, no, don't do that. You know more about your child than the school does. And if something's wrong, you have to get in there and do something about it. And that's what you did. I would love to see school change to the point where the schools were more receptive to that, where schools would say, oh, and I think I tried to do this as an administrator. Again, I'm not saying I was perfect, but I always tried to listen to what the concern was and really think about what is this person saying to me? What are they saying that they need? Wasn't always able to solve the problem because it's a systemic problem. So you did a lot of work on your own, and you didn't get a lot of help from the school system. I think a lot of the time you felt like you had to fight the school system, because they were actually telling you to do things that you later found out were incorrect. So they were actually telling you don't, or they didn't actually say don't do it, but it's not an effective strategy to help kids sound out words.
They said don't sound out words in that meeting that they had with parents. Do not sound out words. Don't have your child sound out words when you read with them at home. You could, but why would you want to?
So how?
I just have to comment, because it's funny. At the very bottom line on the cover of my book, that line got rewritten. I cannot begin to tell you how many times. It's embarrassing. Right now it reads, an intimate look at how schools cause millions of kids to be struggling readers. and what you need to know to help a child succeed. That line originally was, and why no parent should ever blindly trust their child's school. And I was scared that, we live in a self-help society, and everyone was saying, oh, it needs to be positive, and you need to tell parents what they can do. And I was like, but if I'm hit by a bus tomorrow, the message that I want to get out to every parent is no parent should ever blindly trust their child's school. And much to my surprise and joy, every single teacher and every single administrator and former administrator that I have talked to in this past year, whether it's on podcasts, whether it's, I went to a workshop at Columbia for teachers on actually how to podcast, on Twitter, in person, anywhere that I have met someone who works with children in the classroom completely agrees, completely says, no parent should ever blindly trust their child's school. And I thought teachers would hate hearing that message, and teachers so desperately want parents to hear that message and to say, we should work as a team, you should come to us. And even though it wasn't my experience at my son's school, they didn't change their method of teaching. And not to give away too much of the book, but they were lovely, well-intentioned people who listened and actually let me assign him his spelling words. I mean, my older son went to a school where if I had said anything to that principal about the way she was doing things, actually, I did say something to that principal about math. She told me to go find another school, for real. That was her response. She did not want to hear a word. So the teachers that I was working with, they would not have said, don't blindly trust your child's school, but maybe by their actions, they also believe that, because they listened to everything I said. They didn't change immediately. That's a little bit of foreshadowing, but they let me assign him his spelling words, and that was a tremendous help. So I am you made my day, Carl. I am so glad to hear you say that.
Well, and I think it's one of the big flaws in the education system, because it's a pyramid with central office and Board of Education on top, and then building administrators, and then teachers, and then kids and family are on the bottom. And I've said for years, it needs to be flipped. Kids and families need to be at the top. Teachers need to be working with them to help them with what they need. Building administrators need to help teachers do that. Central office should be figuring out how to make all that happen. And one of the, I was just talking to another guy on my podcast, and he's works with all kinds of different schools and homeschooling people. One of the advantages that he finds in small schools and homeschools is the power structure is collapsed. If you're in homeschool, there's really only one person one person to go to. The kid goes to their parent. Or if you're in a micro school where there's 25 kids, there may be 2 adults. There's not this power structure that's got in place. And a frustration for teachers is you get handed these curriculums and these methodologies when maybe what you've been doing works fine. And all of a sudden, everybody's got to do this. One thing I thought was kind of interesting to think about, and this is going to sound like a really kind of a dumb question, I guess, but I think we need to ask it. In the 21st century, how important is reading to people?
Huge, tremendous. In everything now, I mean, who answers the phone? Who makes a phone call these days, right? Everything is email, everything is texting, everything is, yes, on the internet, there are videos for how to do things, but I would say more important than ever before. I mean, it's always been important, but more important than ever before.
And so Do you, is what you're saying, and I think I did a little reading about reading, kind of in preparation for this, because I thought, you know what, I haven't thought about this stuff for a while. I think what I read was that the majority of younger people learning to read need phonics instruction, systematic phonics instruction, but it didn't say 100%. So are there some people that learn to read without getting the systematic phonics?
Everything, and this is where my degree comes in handy. Everything in our species is on a continuum, right? We all have some sensitivity to light, let's say, but some are more sensitive, you know, and some are not sensitive, and some are in the middle, or sensitivity to sound, or the ability to play a musical instrument. You know, there are geniuses who are, you know, musical prodigies, and there are people who are tone deaf. And the same applies to reading. There are kids who, I mean, they literally will pick up reading on their own, and that's a gift. You know, it's a matter of there are 3 parts of our brains that are used when we read. In kids who struggle with reading, those parts of their brains do not light up. There are researchers at Yale, a husband and wife team whose last name is Shaywitz. They've done wonderful research using fMRI machines on children, on adults as they read. So they now, this is now like true science. You know, they've watched how the brain lights up and what works. And in kids who struggle with reading, where it comes hard for them, those areas do not light up. And this is very important because so many kids have unnecessarily been identified or become dyslexic because they did not get the phonics in the early years. If you teach those children with phonics, those areas of the brain light up. They fire, they work, and you can stop so many problems from happening with phonics. Other kids, more in the average part of that bell curve, right? So here you have kids who struggle and really, really, really need phonics, or they will not learn to read. Then you have, you know, the bell curve where more people sit, and they need some combination. You know, like my older son's school did not teach phonics in a very explicit and systematic way. It taught it enough that he got enough phonics, but to this day, he's a terrible speller. And he's now a surgical resident at a great, you know, university, and it didn't hurt him, but everyone benefits from phonics. I used to think, you know, before I began teaching a lot of kids, and this is where it helps to have experience in a classroom or as a tutor, I used to think everybody needed phonics. And for example, a young boy who came to me to be tutored, his parents, he wasn't learning how to read in school. We would teach him a phonics rule, and it would take him, you know, 2 minutes, and he got it. You know, other kids need it for a week. So that's where you see the difference. And like, you know, I would say to the parents, like, I mean, he absorbs this like he's breathing it in. Like he just gets it, and then he applies it. So I think, I'm so sorry, I forgot your original question, which is, are there some kids who do not need phonics? Yes. But they are in the minority. They are going to be on this end of the bell curve. In the middle, where you have most kids, everyone benefits from phonics. No one was ever hurt by being taught phonics. And the hurt that will come from not being taught phonics will show up in spelling for many kids who are reading, you know, okay. You're going to see a deficit in spelling.
That's interesting, because I always noticed in my classes that I'm a pretty good speller, and I had, you know, it always seemed to be the big divide in spelling. You had some kids that just were really good at it, and you had kids that were just really terrible at it. And I had never really thought about the connection between phonics and spelling. So maybe that was why. I always kind of suspected there was a gene or something, because I could never figure it out. Some of the brightest kids were horrible spellers. But that's interesting. So I guess what I'm thinking about as a classroom, say I'm a kindergarten teacher, and I was just at a school. I do some substitute teaching now and then. I was just at a school last week that they have 28 kids in kindergarten. And I can imagine being a kindergarten teacher and trying to figure out, it's bad enough being sixth grade, because again, one of the problems with school is we group kids by age. So we have all these different abilities and interests in one group. Just because they happen to be 5 years old doesn't mean they're at the same spot, you know. So I always said teaching is like the guy in the circus spinning the plates. You got to keep all the plates spinning, right? So there's 28 little bodies, and some of them, and a lot of them probably are in dire need of phonics, and there may be a few that don't. I've already got it. So I was just talking to a guy that's a teacher in Wisconsin that does outdoor education. He does nature education and nature. And he was saying as a kid in kindergarten, he was the kid that got to go read Ranger Rick in the corner because he would get everything done. And he would be, that teacher allowed him to go read Ranger Rick in the corner. But so one of the struggles for teachers is to try to figure out how to accommodate all these different little people. And so I got just wondering if you have any advice or any comments about how that should work, or
I don't have, how should I put it? Firsthand knowledge advice, because my experience in the classroom is limited. My experience in the classroom has been working with struggling readers and teaching the teachers, you know, how to teach
right.
phonics. My hat goes off to teachers because the challenge and just like classroom management and everything, it's just amazing. My intuitive advice, I don't want to say this is expert advice, this is just my opinion. What I would do if I was put in that situation is I would get, and what I have done actually, I would get the good readers involved in helping the struggling readers, because it makes the good readers feel good, right? They're still participating in what the class is doing. I volunteered at a school up in Harlem, in Manhattan, where many kids were struggling with reading, and there was a little boy who was great at it, and his cousin taught him. His 8-year-old cousin taught him how to read, and he was very happy, you know, sort of helping the teacher or helping the kids, because in a classroom, just so many things can go wrong. Here's a humbling story. In addition to writing I Didn't Believe Him, I wrote a series of workbooks that parents and teachers can use to teach children to read. They're systematic phonics workbooks. And I was fortunate enough, the school in Harlem that I mentioned brought my workbooks into the classroom. And I was, you know, newly minted, you know, the book was fresh off the press. It had never been used in a classroom before. And here I was going to save the world, right? My
Right.
workbooks are coming in on this, you know, we're galloping in on a horse, you know, to save the day. She hands out the workbook to all the kids in the classroom, tells them what page to open to. Most of the kids open to the correct page, right? And she begins teaching in front of me. So this is what the book looks like now. It's bound, right? So this couldn't happen. The original version was a spiral binding.
Okay.
I was sitting in the back of the classroom. In front of me sat a boy who the entire time played with the spiral binding of the workbook. And even though I was behind him saying, listen to what your teacher's saying, it's really important. Didn't listen to me, kept playing with the spiral binding. Oh my God, I don't know how teachers do it. Really, I don't know how. My hat goes off to them, because reaching so many children, but I, you know, I'm stopping myself because I'm trying to give constructive advice. And group viability, you know, I know that's frowned upon now in schools, but in a classroom, absolutely, positively group viability, because even if you don't, the kids know their abilities. I don't know how far you've gotten in the book, but like in Eric's classroom, they put what they called stick dots, little colored
I
stickers
read that.
for reading levels, because they didn't want to use letters. They were trying to sort of hide the fact that these
Right.
were reading levels. The kids
Yeah, kids
knew,
know. They always
they knew,
know.
they knew everybody's level. So,
Yeah.
so you're not protecting anyone by not having the groupings. So have the struggling readers at the really struggling readers at the same table, the medium readers, and have the great readers be able to shine, because whoever's a great reader, maybe they're not so great at math. Do you know what I
Hmm.
mean? And they
Hmm.
can be helped in other areas. Everyone has strengths and weaknesses, but definitely group by ability and I'm going to stop there because I think that's
Well,
my
what I
biggest.
tried
But
to get some people to try when I was in administration, I was in a group called the Superintendent's Cabinet. And my idea was, and I've heard about some schools that have done this, have your K-2 block of kids as kind of a flexible group. And so they can be shuffled back and forth depending on the need that they have. That might be one way to have kind of and I interviewed a parent whose daughter did well in kindergarten, but hated first grade. And what happened with her, she was already a reader. And what happened with her in first grade, the teacher didn't take the time to get to know her and didn't understand that she already had accomplished a lot of things with reading, and had to stick with what everybody was doing. She couldn't, and so they moved her into a program that was actually first through third grade, flexible, where they rotated to different teachers and had different experience. And actually, there's a new charter school in my town that has uh, every adult in the building has a reading group. And
wow,
so every day they regroup according to ability. Not regardless of your grade level, you regroup into these groups. So there are things that are being done. And
that's
well, I
great.
was thinking about that little boy that you're talking about playing with the binding. Um, and especially in kindergarten and first grade, I think you have some kids that really aren't ready for school, you know? And because they're 5 or 6, we say, yeah, you're going to school. They haven't, I've got a theory. There's a thing, one of my theories is, which I don't know of any way to prove, except the American Academy of Pediatrics says that every child needs 60 minutes of unrestricted play up till age 10. And so I've got a theory in my mind. I'm thinking of 60 minutes a day for, um, uh, 12, whatever. So you've got all these minutes that you're supposed to have gotten through the years. And some kids come to school and they've had a lot of that. Some kids come to school and they haven't had that play quotient, hasn't been met. And so they're not really ready to sit and attend. They want to play with the binding. That's what they're interested in. Um, Not what about pictures? Because for the so-called balanced literacy, which really wasn't balanced, right? Um, one of the strategies was look at the picture and guess the word,
Hmm.
and that was kind of led to some bad habits.
Hmm.
But some books have pictures and some books don't have pictures. And I was thinking about my Smithsonian magazine. So I'm reading the article and there's lots of photographs, right? And so how do pictures or photographs in a positive way help people when they're reading? Is there a positive side to
Sure.
that?
Oh, absolutely. I went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art a little while ago, and I went to the Arms and Armor exhibit, which is all these knight costumes and uh, weapons that they used, and there were words that I had no idea what they were, and there was a picture above
Hmm.
it, and that's actually when I thought about the question that you're raising. I was like, look at this. This picture totally clues me into what what the word is. So absolutely, but what was going wrong, or what is going wrong still in many balanced literacy classrooms, is the kids aren't being taught how to read the word. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like if
Yeah.
if the picture was of a horse and the child said pony instead of
Hmm.
horse, that word would be accepted as correct. That's no good.
Hmm.
That's just
So
not good.
it just kind of dawned on me. Maybe the difference is when you're at the museum, you're looking at the word first and then looking at the picture. But what
Mm-hmm.
they're telling the kid to do is look at, well, I mean, look at the word, but if you don't know what it is, look at the picture.
No, 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 no. They are not telling the kids to look at the word. They would cover the word up with
Oh, that's
Post-its
right. That's
to
right.
get the kid to look at the picture.
So look at the
They want
picture
the picture
first and,
first.
hmm,
Mm-mm.
interesting. So it's maybe it's the order is what's important.
Mm-hmm.
Look at
Mm-hmm.
the word first, and then if you don't know, maybe the picture will give you an idea, but you still have to have those sounding out skills because
Mm-hmm.
of what you said. You don't want to have horse on the page and read pony. Even
Exactly.
though you're going to get the meaning kind of, it's still not helping you the next time you see the word horse with no picture.
And if you see, exactly, I was going to say, if you see that word on a page and there's no picture, you have no idea what the word is.
And then later, as we grow in reading, the pictures could become fewer and fewer, right? Um, Interesting. Um, so is there a critical age? Because I know some people start to panic about 6 or 7 years old
Mm-hmm.
if a kid's not reading. And interestingly, though, again, one of the things I think school may get wrong is if Carl's 7 years old and he's not reading yet, let's double his reading instruction. Let's give him twice as much of the same thing that hasn't worked up till now.
Right, right. You
So
need,
is there like I know I've read stories of even adults learning to read, at an advanced age, but does it become more difficult the older?
mm-hmm. It does become more difficult. Studies have shown that if kids don't catch up by the end of first grade, then it becomes harder for them. Not that they won't do it. It becomes harder and it becomes anxiety producing. I think third grade is when things sort of really become an issue because kids hit a wall and they're not able to read the words because the pictures disappear. Um, and what happens is you can always teach someone to decode. There is never, it's not like they've done studies with kittens where they've covered their eyes and their ability to see that never happens after a certain critical point. It's not like that with decoding. You can always teach someone to decode. My workbooks have been used in prisons, and one prisoner has taught another prisoner to read, and just the joy that brings to people. I've heard stories of people teaching their grandparents how to read. So you can always teach someone to decode. It's not as if our brains turn off to that ability. But what happens if you do not learn to read well by the end of first grade, the beginning of second grade, you start to not like to read. You
Hmm.
start to not read. So there goes your vocabulary development because, if you're an avid reader, you're reading books and you're learning things, you're learning words in those books that we don't use in our spoken language. And vocabulary builds upon vocabulary. And a love of reading builds upon a love of reading, right? You read one story, you love it. You can't wait to read the next story, and it becomes something that you enjoy. And then that affects your trajectory in school because reading, it's not just about reading little storybooks, right? If you love to read, all of a sudden you'll realize you can read this nonfiction article and the whole world opens up to you and you can learn about this or that or whatever on the internet now. I mean, the world is at our fingertips. But if that inherent love of reading isn't there, then vocabulary is affected, comprehension is affected because comprehension is shown to be a matter of what you know about what you're reading, what you're bringing, your background knowledge that you're bringing to the table. Like I worked with a little girl who was Chinese and had never heard about cowboys, and she was reading a story about cowboys and was befuddled. Just really didn't get it, like corral, sorry, rancher, just everything. She was so confused. Um, so all of those aspects of reading, because reading consists of 5 things. Reading well consists of 5 things. It consists of phonemic awareness, being able to hear the sounds in spoken words. Or these are the 5 pillars of effective reading instruction. Not that reading consists of this. Phonemic awareness, hearing the sounds in spoken words. Phonics, knowing how to sound out words. vocabulary, because I can't tell you, I mentioned we're a K through 12 tutoring company. I can't tell you how many kids struggle with reading because they don't know the words and the passages that they're reading. And they were not readers, and they were not told, look up the words. And vocabulary isn't taught in many schools. Again, I'm speaking for New York. You know, it's a big country. There are plenty of schools out there that do teach vocabulary. You know, I'm not making blanket statements about anything, but many schools in my area do not teach vocabulary. Most of the schools are progressive and believe that kids, you know, will pick up this knowledge on their own. And I just want to stress, you know, like Rousseau's writing, which is at the foundation of progressive education. He wrote Emily, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but you know, the teacher or guide in Rousseau's theory and writing, he had a plan. He knew what he wanted his student to discover. He didn't just send them out to discover. And a lot of teachers now just send kids out to discover. You know, they're not guiding them towards a particular discovery, towards like, oh, what do these words mean? But anyway, I'm getting off topic. So sorry. Vocabulary, fluency, stopping at periods, being able to read the way we talk, and comprehension, understanding what you're reading. So that was a very long answer to your question of, you can always teach someone to read enough to be functional in our society. You know, to go to Costco. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to Costco in New York, and I've seen people who are new immigrants to New York, because Manhattan now has many, many new immigrants, and they're lost. They're looking at the sign. They don't understand how to order. They don't understand, you know, and we help them whenever we can. You can get someone to the point where they can, you know, read a menu, they can function, they can read enough to read. But to become a good reader, the earlier you teach a child to be able to do it, the more you get those other benefits.
Yeah, I think I can see that, because I was thinking about it like almost like an athlete or a musician. They may have a natural ability, but if they don't learn some of the foundations early on, it's going to be harder for them later. So I have two more questions, and one is, how do you think the preponderance of electronic devices have changed things?
I think, and again, this is just me speculating because I haven't experienced it myself and I haven't, you know, really read research on it, but this is me speculating. I raised my kids, you know, they had the electronic toys, but we limited them. I see kids, and I hate to sound judgmental because everyone does what they need to do, and I'm not passing judgment, but you know, on the streets in New York or wherever, or in restaurants, I see little kids on their devices in the stroller or in the restaurant, and you know, my kids, they looked around, you know, they took in the world, and you start developing. I would give, I know the reason you asked that question, I think, and my advice would be, I would give little ones books before I gave them electronic devices, because electronic devices, I'm guilty of it. At the end of a long day, I want to sit on the couch with my husband and watch a show on Netflix. You know, I don't want to sit there and read a book, because reading a book is effort. It takes work. I think it's much easier, you know, social media is out there, and kids are on their devices. But again, social media, if you're talking about just reading, they have to read, you know, they're reading the posts. They're not all just little video clips. I mean, some are, like on TikTok, but they're because my area or my passion is developing competence in early readers, I would say give your kids a board book or a book to look through instead of an electronic device whenever possible. You know, of course, being a parent is hard work, and you need to put your kids in front of the TV sometimes, and you need to give them an electronic device because you want to have a conversation with your spouse. but I would say try to limit it in young children.
So this is a question I try to ask everybody. If you had the magic wand and you could make schools anything you wanted, or if you could start a school, the Irene Daria school, what would it look like? You have all the power in the world to do whatever you want to.
I would, now I'm talking about a school that begins with kindergarten.
Mhm.
I would start with reading. I would start with reading, and I would make, I don't know how to qualify it in hours, because the hours in a classroom are really long. You know, like there's a lot of time there. But I would really make the focus on making sure that kids learn how to read. It is so easy, Carl. It is so easy to teach a child to read. I read all these misconceptions on the internet. Don't teach your child yourself. Leave it to an expert. It's so hard. Learning to read is hard work. No, it isn't. It really isn't. If a child is taught correctly from the beginning, and there are so many fun ways to do it. There are games to play. There are, you know, my workbooks have like board games and bingo games and computer activities, or I haven't posted it yet. I keep wanting to post it on my website. I did a lesson teaching a class, Silent E, and it was golden. Magic happened in that moment. And it was like, we started with a website called Starfall. We reviewed, then we started with a website called Starfall. I projected it onto the whiteboard. I got the whole class involved in coming up and clicking and, you know, making it go on to the next word. It solidified them as a group. It got them excited. We moved on to doing some worksheets, a couple of worksheets, like 2. But they were broken up into groups, and someone was supervising each table to make sure that they were actually doing it. Then they played a game, a bingo game. They loved that. And you could actually hear on the video one of the boys. Now, this is a struggling reader saying, "This is fun." Magic, right? Magic. Read to them, read stories. Have your activities, like you mentioned, play. Those kids need play. When I first started tutoring little ones, I did group lessons. Now it's all private, but I did group lessons. And I would do things like when we were learning short U, I would take them to Washington Square Park. I would bring acorns that I had gathered elsewhere on Long Island, and I gave the kids acorns, and they fed nuts to the squirrels. They remembered short U, that way, or like, other activities. You could play games with sounds. I mean, I could go on and on, but my school, the early focus would be literacy, and those kids would be reading so quickly. We're not talking all of kindergarten and first grade, and we're not talking reading Dostoevsky at the end of kindergarten, right? We're talking reading basic short vowel words and the most frequently used sight words, and getting them up to reading blends, which are like words like stop and clap. By the end of kindergarten, they can definitely do that. And once that has begun, then I would introduce math, and then I would but I would actually no, math would have to be, sorry, I'm like, oh, this is fun to do, right? You'll have plenty of time for math too. The day is long, but I would definitely focus on reading first.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for being here. And
Pleasure.
tell us the name of your book again, and people can
Sure.
look for it. I'm going to put the website address. If there's any other links you want me to put in the show notes, just send them to my email. But I'm going to put your one website in there for sure.
Great. So the name of the book is I Didn't Believe Him. And that's the story of what I went through with my son and Eric. And the name of the workbooks, they're called Steps to Reading. And yeah, my website is stepstoreading.com, okay. So people can find info on that elsewhere. But Carl, I don't think I have your email. Can I get your email?
Sure. I'll give it to you here in a second. Let me do my little outro thing, and then we can talk a little bit more. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, so you can be notified each time a new episode comes out. Check out my book, Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn, How We Can Transform Schools and Reintroduce Natural Learning. A couple podcasts I recommend are Liberated Podcast with Carrie McDonald and Fear of the Free Child with Akila Richards. Check out my band, The Rush Show, at therustshow.com and all streaming platforms. Thanks for listening. Remember, get out of the way and let kids learn. Where's my stop button? This has been Get Out of the Way and Let Kids Learn podcast. If you liked it, please subscribe, follow, share, and leave a comment.